I'll hand over now to Andy Richardson. Andy is the Marketing Director of the Allium and Brassica Agronomy based in South Lincolnshire. Andy has been advising growers on all aspects of agronomy and crop storage for over 30 years. He's the author of 5 Assured Produce Protocols and is the Technical Director for the UK Brassica Growers Association. So we're very lucky to have Andy. And again, I just encourage you to put questions to Andy after his presentation. And I'll let you take it away, Andy. Thank you.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Eoin, and good evening to you all. Let's see if we can. Sorry, for some reason it started at the wrong place. Let's start at the beginning. Okay, yep. Good evening, everyone. I think the results of the poll were interesting, if for me somewhat a little bit unexpected, really. Broccoli is the one thing that I really struggle to get my growers to spray any fungicides on at all. So we can talk about some of the issues that we have, but as a crop we try and grow that as cheaply as we can. I think that was number one on your hit list. So we'll talk about some of the issues around that. And I'm guessing the number 2 disease being downy mildew, as it would maybe looking at some internal downy mildew issues or systemic downy mildew issues in broccoli. So we will certainly cover that. With regard to the last point, in terms of what you guys are thinking is one of the bigger problems of the control loss of actives, we're certainly very limited in the number of the actives that we have, particularly in their modes of action. We're really relying on 3 fungicide groups for the vast majority of disease control. But there are new things coming through in the world of fungicides, and certainly there's more hope for new fungicides than there perhaps is for new insecticides and new herbicides, which are much more difficult to get approved. So we'll cover those points as we go through this evening. The main things I was going to talk to you today, really, we're going to just kind of a quick run through the main leaf spot diseases, and we'll look at some of the options we have for control. We'll then talk a bit about the eumycete diseases, so things like downy mildew and white blister, and we'll look at what options we've got for control of them. And then we've got a fair chunk where we're going to look just at different fungicide programs for the various different brassica crops. I'm mostly going to talk to you about leaf and flowerhead brassica, because I wasn't going to cover sweet and turnips, but I'm happy to answer any questions on sweet and turnips if you want to type a question in, or indeed at any point through, if you want to type a question in, we'll collate those together, and I'll try my best to answer as many as I can at the end. So we'll look at the fungicide programs for the various crops. We'll just touch briefly on clubroot. I know you had a seminar with Professor Jeff Dixon, a recent seminar with him. He's kind of the world expert on clubroot, and I'm not anywhere near his sort of level, but I'll just touch on a few of the things to do with clubroot, which may get a few of you asking questions. We'll then talk briefly about virus diseases, and I think there's 1 or 2 of you guys out there that are storing cabbage, so we'll just have a look at some of the storage diseases and some of the things that we've been trying over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of reducing some of those issues that we see in store. So please type lots of questions in, and we'll do our best to answer those at the end. Okay, so just to run through the major diseases that we have, probably the major one for us over in Lincolnshire, and I think speaking to Andy and Eoin, the major one for you really is ring spot. Most of this disease is airborne, so it spreads from overwinter crops into spring crops pretty easily. The typical defining symptoms of ring spot has these rings of, let's see if we can get my pointer up. Okay, has these rings of black pycnidia within, which make it fairly obvious. The other thing that's really characteristic of ring spot has a very definite edge to the lesion. Things like dark leaf spot, Phoma have a much yellower, less well-defined edge, and it's really a sort of cool, wet weather type disease. So we start to see it usually middle of August, first symptoms, particularly about a wet August like we had this last year, long periods of leaf wetness. But it really only gets going when temperatures above 10 degrees C. So once we get to the sort of middle end of November, generally the disease, or infection risk anyway, drops off. But like a lot of the diseases, the time between actually getting infection into the leaf and then expressing symptoms can be quite long. And it's typically sort of 2 to 3 weeks at its quickest, but it can be as long as 8 to 10 weeks when it's cold. So infections in November may not show up until February, March the following year. Okay. So that's ring spot. Next slide is light leaf spot. For me, light leaf spot is a big issue with us in northern England through into Scotland, but also in the west of the UK where we're growing in Lancashire, particularly we're growing sprouts in Lancashire. It likes long periods of leaf wetness. It's really a cool, wet weather disease. You're looking at 100 hours of leaf wetness or more for infection. Quite strong resistance to tebuconazole in the UK. So to one of the main triazoles that we use, and that's really because it's predominantly a disease of oilseed rape. At one point here in the UK, we were growing 550. So we were growing a big chunk of oilseed rape. That's now half of what it was, but still we get significant risk from light leaf spot. I think oilseed rape is growing in Ireland, obviously to a much lesser extent, but oilseed rape is fantastic for spreading light leaf spot. Mostly what we see on crops are these kind of smudgy marks, almost look like smudgy fingerprints. And sometimes they can look just like general sort of weathering on the tops of buttons. If you're not sure if something's like leaf spot or not, best thing to do is to stick it in a plastic bag, just put it somewhere warm for a couple of days in a sealed bag, and it'll start to sporulate, and you can see this sort of white sort of specks that come on the lesions, and that's a really good way of identifying it. Dark leaf spot, probably more common for you guys than it is for us. We tend to be a little bit drier in our autumns, so a wet, warm autumn is great for Alternaria. And it tends to be a problem we get more on the continent as well, particularly if we're growing in Belgium or Holland. They would tend to see more dark leaf spot than we would do on the eastern side of the UK. Can cause damping off as well, so you can get almost wild stem type symptoms on seedlings, particularly if you get a lot of infection in the greenhouse. No Picnia, so we've got none of those little black spots on the lesion. And very often the lesions look almost like a sort of cut tree trunk. So you end up with these sort of rings of growth rings, if you like, sorry, through the lesion. The other thing that differentiates it from ring spot, it's got a far less clearly defined edge. You tend to get quite a lot of yellowing around the edge of the lesion, but really a warm, wet disease. So July, end of July, August, September, really the main times of disease, whereas August, September, October, November are really the sort of months we're looking for ring spot. And then Phoma leaf spot, again, similar conditions to dark leaf spot. So it's kind of warm, mild, wet conditions, usually sort of July, August, September, maybe into October. Can also form cankers on plant stems and can cause issues on swedes as well. It has the black pycnidia, so it has these little black dots in it like we see on ring spot, but they tend to be randomly scattered throughout the whole lesion, so they're not in circles as they are with ring spot. And then a disease which isn't a ring spot, but one which I've sort of bunged together with a leaf spot, because the fungicides we use are pretty similar in terms of control. So that's powdery mildew. Obviously, powdery mildew happens on the top surface of the leaves generally, although if we see it in Brussels sprouts and kale, we tend to see it on the underside of the leaf, which can be confusing, and we also tend to see it on the leaf, the main leaf stems, the leaf petioles, but also the main stems of the plant. You get these sort of black smudgy marks on the stems, which can, in the case of Brussels sprouts, will also grow onto the buttons. So it almost looks like the leaf's been dusted with a fine white powder. Similar conditions to in terms of times of the year and temperatures to dark leaf spot and to dark leaf spot and to Phoma, but we're looking more for sort of humid type weather than we are rainfall. And that's really why this disease does so well on kale and Brussels sprouts. Kale and Brussels sprouts found these nice big canopies, sort of series of overlapping umbrellas, and they really trap humidity within that canopy. And that's sort of ideal conditions for powdery mildew. So we just briefly run through some of the fungicides that we have. We will go more as we look at the individual crops into the programs, but just to run through the sorts of fungicides that we have for control for those leaf spots. So in terms of protectant, you and us in the UK, we've got a couple of sprays of Amistar. We don't tend to use straight Amistar on the majority of crops, just because, like us, you're also restricted in terms of the amount of Amistar that you can put on. So we tend to use, instead of straight Amistar, we tend to use that in mixes with difenoconazole. We'll either make it ourselves, mix it with Score, or we'll use Amistar top. In terms of the eradicants, we have a couple of triazoles, a couple of straight triazoles. Rudis is probably the best triazole out there for control of the leaf spots. It's also pretty reasonable on powdery mildew as well. So for me, it's the strongest triazole that we have. Score difenoconazole, a good product. It's not as persistent as prothioconazole in the plants. It doesn't last as long. And I think if you're going to use difenoconazole, particularly if you've got a reasonable level of disease, then you really need to be using it at the ½ litre rate rather than the 0.3 rate. You also have Cygnum. Cygnum is a good sort of protectant. It's not particularly strong against the leaf spots, but it certainly does something. Pyraclostrobin is probably a stronger strobe, particularly against, if you're looking for preventative control of white blister than azoxystrobin. A new approval then, we've got a mix of an STHI plus difenoconazole in Perseus, which is great. It's a good product. Fluxapyroxad is really good at powdery mildew control. So if you're getting issues with powdery mildew on Brussels sprouts, then Perseus certainly should be in the program. It's very strong against powdery mildew. And then Amistar, then we've got just a couple of strobilurin and triazole products, sort of combination products, if you like. Amistar top, which is pretty widely used. Good mix of products. Not particularly, the difen isn't particularly persistent, but it is a good general mix, and it's a solid rate of difenoconazole as well. It's equivalent to ½ litre of Score. And then we've got Nativo, and I think we've only got a couple of applications of Nativo. You've got 2, or I think there's 3 on Brussels sprouts with you. Strong triazole, so you've got tebuconazole plus trifloxystrobin. So again, a triazole trifloxy mix. We tend to use this early in our programs because tebuconazole can hang around in the plants for quite a long time. So we tend to use most Nativo through September, October. Once conditions get dull and overcast and cool, and the product doesn't break down that quickly, we then tend to switch to Amistar top or Rudis, really. I mean, there's no issues with you exceeding any MRL with tebuconazole, but if we're selling to one of the discounters, then we've got to make sure that we are below 50% of the MRL to sell to them, or else we end up having to write them reports and letters. So they're the options that we have. Let's move on to look at the Oomycete diseases. So in terms of Oomycetes, we've just got 2 that I'm going to talk to you about. We will cover a third, but right at the very end of the talk. So the first and the main one that you'll be aware of is white blister. You get these sort of chalky white pustules on the leaves. Very similar conditions to powdery mildew, warm, humid rather than wet conditions. Again, we'd start to see that similar sort of timing as powdery mildew, really. So it's really a July to October type disease. As soon as things get cooler, then the infection risk drops out. The spores of white blister, if you ever flicked one of the lesions, are quite big. You could see them, so they don't tend to travel that far. So we see white blister tends to occur in patches in the field rather than spread across the whole field. And we'll talk about some of the options to control in a slide or 2. And then the next one, and this come up quite highly quite high on the survey you guys did at the start, and that's downy mildew. And I can probably understand that. You're obviously a much higher rainfall area than we would be. So our rainfall over in Lincolnshire is around about 550 mils a year. I suspect in some areas of Ireland, yours is probably double that. Cool, wet conditions, absolutely ideal for downy mildew, really. It's one of these diseases which can be easy to misidentify, particularly when it's dry, because you won't see the fluff on the underside of the leaf, the white fluff. You'll just see sort of brown or blacky type marks on the top and maybe on the underside of the leaf. If you stick it in a plastic bag, you stick it in your airing cupboard somewhere in the dark, it will sporulate, and that makes it quite a bit easier to identify. So as well as downy mildew on leaves, and for us, things like cauliflower, broccoli to a lesser extent than us, but I'll talk to you a bit about systemic mildew and broccoli. So cauliflower and spring greens are the two crops that it's biggest issue for us. Then in terms of the fungicides that we have for these oomycetes, we've obviously got Amastar, which we've already talked about. We've got Infinito, which I think you have, same as us, is just a single spray. Very, very effective against downy mildew. Not particularly useful against white blister, but it will do something. The other product you have, and I guess this is probably the result of you losing the approval for Ridamil, which was Mancozeb plus metalaxyl-M. There is a straight metalaxyl-M product, SL567A, which I guess if any of you are growing carrots out there, you'd probably be using for cavity spot control. So that can be used on sprouts, cabbage, and cauliflower. It's really strong against white blister. A little bit against mildew, will do mildew, but for me, Infinito and the next product, Rebus, are best for mildew. Save your SL567A for white blister control. And then Rebus, it's fungicide which has come out over the last 2 or 3 years. Useful for downy mildew control predominantly. Doesn't do an awful lot against white blister, and you've got it approved for you guys for broccoli, cauliflower, and also on Brussels sprouts. To me, broccoli and cauliflower are the two. Downy mildew for me on sprouts isn't generally an issue. Okay, so Andy and Owen asked me to talk to you a little bit about disease forecasting. So disease forecasting, something which we've been involved with for the past 20 years or so. We started off giving forecasts like on this graph at the bottom here. We were just simply looking at the weather. So this is a ring spot forecast back from 2007. And basically what we're looking for here was we're looking for temperatures above 10 degrees C, and then for 3 days where we've got leaf wetness of more than 18 hours per day. So it's quite a simple model. But you can see that gives us quite a lot of infection risk. So where we get a green bar, it's no risk. Where we get a red bar or a yellow bar, we've got a risk of infection. But of course, what we don't know from that, okay, the weather's right for the spores to infect, but have we got any spores in the air? And that was kind of the missing link for the first sort of 7-8 years that we run the forecast. So we were effectively telling people that most weeks there was some risk from ring spot. We couldn't really tell them what the risk was because we didn't have any spores around. So it wasn't particularly useful. There was then a series of projects looking at determining how many spores we needed in the air of each disease to give us significant levels of infection. So that work was done. And then we started to put out these spore traps. So this is a Burkhardt spore trap. We put these out in the fields. They face into the wind, and there's a little vacuum cleaner inside which sucks a sample of air 24 hours a day. And also inside that machine's a little clockwork mechanism, so we can collect that air sample for each day into a tiny little plastic vial. Now those vials will be very similar to what you guys would be using for your lateral flow test for COVID. Okay, so we're putting a little bit of liquid in with those spores, we shake it up, and we then put a drop or two on these lateral flow tests. Again, exactly the same as you would do if you're doing a lateral flow COVID test. And then Within 10 minutes, we can see if we've got a significant level of disease or not. So we've caught a significant number of spores or not in those traps. We can then go back and look for the day that we had our weather, our right amount of leaf wetness, and the temperature's correct. And then we can say, yes, that was a day in that area where we've got the potential for ring spot infection, or no, the weather was great, but we didn't have the right number of spores in the air. So we can give a really accurate forecast. So we've been doing this for the last probably 10 years or maybe 12 years actually now or so. We started off doing it off our own back, and that's in the last 7 or 8 years that's been sponsored by Syngenta. So it's done completely free of charge for all the growers in Lincolnshire, and indeed you guys can, if you want to know what the disease risk is in Lincolnshire, you can use that link on the slide there and log on and just see what sort of forecast we give out. It's a really simple forecast. We just say for the week it's been a red, an amber, or a green forecast. Okay, so definite infection, maybe, or no infection. And to be fair, mostly we're reds or greens, so we're pretty good at saying yes, it's a week where we've had infection, or no, it's not. And the nice thing about all the diseases that we're doing it for, so that's ring spot, light leaf spot, dark leaf spot, and powdery mildew, is that there's a reasonable latent period. So there's a reasonable period of time between the plant becoming infected and that infection then showing on the leaf of the plant. So as long as we put a spray before that infection shows on our crop, and then we should never see any disease in that crop. So this is systemic downy mildew in broccoli. Okay, you can see it's not Spirot. The disease has come up from the stem and not down from the beads. And this is more commonly that we see this sort of browny black smudginess in the center of the broccoli. Now, I don't know if this is a problem for you guys in Ireland. I'm kind of assuming that it might be from the poll at the start. And I think if it is, then using a protectant spray with Amistar about a month after you plant, and then sort of 2 weeks later going back in with some Rebus or some Infinito will stop a lot of this happening. This isn't a particular problem to me in Lincolnshire, but it's a problem that the guys do have in Lancashire occasionally, and it's quite a common problem in Scotland, particularly if the transplants come out with a reasonable amount of downy mildew on them. And then cauliflower wise, we're pretty simple in what we do. Most of the summer, early autumn cauliflower, we wouldn't spray at all with a fungicide. It's only really those crops that we're harvesting end of November into December, and we chuck on a bit of Amistar top at the end of September, and then middle of October we give them a dose of Rudis, and that would be all we would do on them. Obviously, if the crop's later, if it's a end of December type variety or early January, then we just push those sprays back a couple of weeks. And again, white blister wise, SL 567A you guys have, that can be mixed in with that Amistar top of the Rudis if you're seeing white blister, and similarly if you're seeing downy mildew, then Infinito or Rebus could be mixed in. On the winter cauliflower, I had a word with one of my growers when I was writing this talk. And this is a guy that, if I can persuade him to spray one fungicide on winter cauliflower, I'll be doing quite well, really. I mean, his view, and I can understand it completely, is, we've got to grow this stuff as cheap as we can. What's the point in me sticking fungicides on in the autumn, Andy, when all those leaves are just going to fall off over the winter? And I think my argument is, yeah, what if they don't fall off over the winter? What if we have a mild winter as the one we've just had, and that disease then starts to get onto the young leaves, which is what we're going to sell. Okay, so that's kind of where we are. Again, really simple. We would probably go in with a relatively strong triazole strobe mix, so Nativo, which is quite persistent. That would be sort of early to mid October, and then end of October to early November going with a Rudis. We wouldn't normally apply a fungicide in the spring. Okay, so our aim would be to keep the leaves clean going into winter, and then we wouldn't normally put something on in the spring. If we did go back in the spring, particularly for something that maybe in April, May, type harvest, the winter cauliflower, then we'd probably just go back with a litre of Amastar Top. On kale, we don't have many options on kale for control, so we've got Cygnum and we've got Amastar Top. So the only thing we can do really is alternate the two. We found better effect out of the Cygnum if we mix it with a non-arnic wetter, so something like Activator 90. Okay, and again, white blister for you guys. Putting Cygnum in is the best you can hope for in terms of preventing it becoming a problem. Powdery mildew is a fairly big issue with us. We have a couple of products that we can use. The first one is Karma, which is potassium hydrogen carbonate. And the other one, which we hope will come through at some point this coming season, is Cicadas. And Cicadas is that SDHI out of Perseus. Okay, very, very good for powdery mildew control. Spring greens. So for us, white blister, again, we don't have anything that we could, or there's nothing that you guys can spray. Downy mildew, then Infinito does a pretty good job. For us and for you, same sprays as we have for kale, really. So it's alternating Amastar Top and Cygnum, really, to keep the crops clean. Brussels sprouts. Sorry, they're just talking about the white blister. You've got the SL567A for your white blister. Powdery mildew on sprouts, then we're using a product called Karma. Or if powdery mildew is a problem for you guys, then Perseus swapped into the program for Amastar Top would be really useful. So fluxapyroxane in Perseus is really good against powdery mildew. So there's lots of different ways of doing the job on sprouts. I would say the only thing to stay clear of is using the Tivo too late in the program, particularly if you're supplying an Aldi or a Lidl, and you've got to be 50% lower than the MRLs, really. Other than that, you pay your money and takes your choice. Strongest product there would be Rudis. So if ring spot is a real issue to you and dark leaf spot, then I'd probably try and switch some of those out and get my 3 Rudises in that program. But that gives you some idea of the sorts of ways that we would run a program across in Lincolnshire. Cabbage, so I've sort of split this into 2 types. So we've got storage cabbage. We're fairly strong, so we store about 3,000 tons of storage cabbage on our site. I've had storage cabbage leak out under the door, so we have a fairly strong, robust program on our storage cabbage, and I think that gives us a lot less. It reduces our trimming losses quite significantly if we can keep those heads clean, because if we get any ring spot developing on the heads in store, then inevitably we get botrytis on top, and that just increases my trimming costs. So that gives you some idea of the sort of program that we'd run on storage cabbage. We're very strong on Rudis in those storage cabbage programs, just to keep the ring spot down to an absolute minimum. And then on autumn and winter cabbage, it's the typical Amastar Top and the Tivo. On the Tivo early in the program, and then Rudis and finish with an Amastar Top to keep the residues that we have to a minimum. And then just over the next 5 minutes, just to finish off, a couple of bacterial diseases. Xanthomonas. Xanthomonas is one of those diseases which you'll always find odd lesions in crops, particularly some of the cauliflowers, some of the sort of late autumn and winter cauliflowers, a little bit susceptible to it. You get these characteristic yellow-shaped lesions with black veins in them. In terms of control, now obviously we don't have copper anymore. Keeping the leaves clean, so those strobe triazole mixes, whether you're using Amastar, whether you're using Amastar Top or using the Tivo, keeping the leaves clean, keeping them free of alternaria ring spot usually gives you much less issue with Xanthomonas. And the other thing is nutrition. So too much nitrogen, too much soft growth will make your crop more susceptible to Xanthomonas. But to be honest, guys, I think it's 10 years since I've seen any economic loss from Xanthomonas, certainly in the UK. Spirot, yeah, another bacteria disease for us. The biggest problem for us is normally September, October, November. So periods of frost or very cold, windy weather followed by rain or long periods where the heads are wet. Those bacteria splash up from the ground, grow down into the flower buds, and then down into the stems. In terms of control, we don't have any copper that we can spray anymore. So getting the nitrogen right is important, particularly if we're growing a broccoli crop after another broccoli crop, making sure we don't put too much nitrogen on, because that makes a massive difference. There are big differences between varieties. And the other thing which I think does work is if you're using a bit of Amistar on the crop, a couple of goes of Amistar seems to keep the whole seems to keep the whole plant much healthier, really, and gives us less issues. So a lot of the guys, my guys, will certainly, a month after planting or 5 weeks after planting, they'll put a litre of Amistar on for that crop they're harvesting back into September into October, and then they'll do another one a couple of weeks later. That stops any white blister, which can be a challenge at that time of year, but B, it does seem to give us stronger plants and more able to resist the Spirot. But don't be spraying anything when the heads are showing. So anything you spray once the heads are bigger than your small fingernail, there is a risk of dewaxing them and making the situation worse. Clubroot. I'm sure you all know about clubroot. There is a really nice soil PCR test to tell you your level of clubroot in your soils. If you don't know, most of the soils that we sample in Lincolnshire were 100,000 spores per gram of soil. Anything above 10,000 spores per gram will give you has a potential to give you clubroot, and the higher that level is, the more risk there is. But obviously the biggest risk with clubroot is having a lot of rain just after planting. That enables those spores to germinate and the little swimming zoospores to grab hold of the roots. So improving drainage in the field, having a rotation of 5 or 6 years, all of these things can make a massive difference, as can, liming up to 7.5 if that's applicable to you. The other things like Limex, and of course Jeff would have spoken to you about Pulka. Both of those products can certainly ease symptoms of the disease. And then just a couple of viruses I'm going to talk to you about quickly, so we can end just in the next sort of couple of minutes or so. Give me a chance to answer some questions. The main virus we have in the UK is turnip yellows virus. Oilseed rape acts as a massive source of infection over the winter. So any aphids, peach potato aphid in particular, feeding on oilseed rape over the winter, then transfer that to our brassica crops. The other virus, which is interesting but is sort of much less economically damaging, is Turnip Mosaic virus. The cabbage you can see here on the right, this is the sort of typical external symptoms we'd see of Turnip Mosaic, right? These old sort of whorls and swirls on the top of the cabbage. And cauliflower mosaic virus, to be honest with you, it's relatively rare for us to see that. And obviously all of these are aphid transmitted primarily by peach potato aphid. So these plants here we infected early, so soon after planting with turnip yellows virus, and the plants to the side are unaffected. So effectively the plants just look stunted. There's no other symptoms generally of turnip yellows virus on those plants. If we put those cabbage into store where we've got early high levels of turnip yellows virus infection, then we can get tip burn symptoms in store cabbage. This was a picture taken back from 2003, before we had neonic seed treatments. So we used first imidacloprid and then thiacloprid on the seed. They're incredibly effective at stopping these sorts of symptoms. Obviously, we lost those seed treatments 2 years ago, and we're starting to see this as a problem again now in stored cabbage. We saw it last year and we're starting to see it this year too. Okay, so these sort of internal symptoms are starting to build up. And if we test the cabbage, we're finding relatively high levels of turnip yellows virus. So turnip mosaic virus, we train the guys cutting not to cut these and put these into store. They're generally around the edge of the fields where we've perhaps not got to, we've not managed to get the sprayer into to kill the aphids. But Turnip Mosaic gives you these quite exciting symptoms, which we call cigar burn, and these develop in store on stored cabbage. And then in the next 30 seconds, we'll just talk really briefly about storage cabbage diseases. So a couple of diseases which I'm concerned about as a storage cabbage storer. The main one is Botrytis grey mold, which basically gets going on any damage on the heads. The spores are all around in the air. If there's any damage or cell sap on the outside of the cabbage, the fungus will germinate and then start growing, and we get a sort of nice snotty, furry coating to the cabbage, which then increases my trimming loss and also increases my trimming costs as well. So that's the main disease we have. The other disease we have, in particularly wet autumns and winters, is Phytophthora. We did used to have a fungicide drench for both. So we used Rothel for Botrytis, and we used SL567A, so that metalaxyl-M, for Phytophthora control. We lost both approvals, Rothel 3 seasons ago, and metalaxyl 2 seasons ago. So what we have for a drench now is Serenade for Botrytis control, which is pretty reasonable in a normal year. In a very wet year, it doesn't work quite so well, but in a normal year, it certainly reduces our trimming losses. And at the moment, we have absolutely nothing for Phytophthora control, okay, which can be a real challenge in a wet harvest year.